The night Elias Cade finally spoke more than 5 words to a living soul, the whole of Redemption Creek stood still enough that you could hear the fiddle strings trembling in the autumn air, though nobody would admit afterward that they had been watching quite so intently. It was the autumn of 1878, and Redemption Creek, Texas, was the kind of town that had clawed itself out of red dust and stubbornness. Settlers had hammered it into existence along a bend of the Colorado River, where pecan trees grew thick, and the soil ran deep enough to coax wheat and corn from the earth if you were patient, and mean enough to fight the drought years. The town had a general store, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple that nobody had gotten around to straightening, a saloon called the Brass Spur, and just enough people to make Sunday mornings feel like a community and Saturday nights feel like a dare. They had railroad dreams that hadn't arrived yet, land disputes that had drawn blood the previous spring, and the kind of collective pride that makes small places feel enormous to the people inside them. Elias Cade had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 years prior, in the late summer of 1875, on a horse the color of ash and with nothing but a bedroll, a Winchester rifle, and a canvas sack of tools. He had ridden into town on a Thursday afternoon when the heat was so fierce that even the flies had given up, tied his horse to the post outside the general store, walked in, and placed a handful of gold coins on the counter in front of Hector Beaumont, who owned the store and most of the commercial properties in town. He had said 4 words: "I need work land." Hector, a broad man with a gray mustache that made him look permanently disapproving, had looked at the coins and then at the man. Elias Cade was tall, somewhere north of 6 feet, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar from the heat and the dust of hard riding. He had pale gray eyes that were unsettling in the way that still water is unsettling because you cannot see the bottom. His face was lean and weathered for someone who appeared to be in his late 20s, and there was a quality about him, not menace exactly, but a density, a weight of attention in his stillness that made people stop what they were doing. Hector had told him about the 40 acres northeast of town that old Amos Purdy had abandoned after his wife died, and the grief had driven him to Abilene. The land needed clearing and the small house needed considerable repair, but the price was honest and the coins were real. Elias had paid for it without a word of negotiation, collected a deed from the county registrar the following morning with a single nod, and ridden out to begin the work of making something from nothing. Over the 3 years that followed, the people of Redemption Creek assembled a fairly complete portrait of Elias Cade from the fragments he let fall. He paid his debts promptly. He bought his supplies regularly from Beaumont's store without complaint. He did not drink at the Brass Spur, which made some people uneasy in the way that abstinence sometimes does when a town has decided that drinking is a form of belonging. He attended church perhaps once every 6 weeks, sitting in the back pew and departing before anyone could approach him with a handshake. He had twice helped pull a wagon from the creek crossing when the water ran high in the spring, doing so without being asked and without waiting to be thanked. He had, on one documented occasion, frightened off 3 rough men from the Caldwell outfit who had been leaning on the widow Harkins over a fence dispute, doing it entirely by riding up, stopping his horse, and looking at them with those gray eyes until they decided their business was finished. 5 words, though. That was the recognized limit. Those who had ventured conversation received, at most, 5 words in reply and usually fewer. Dorothea Ames, who ran the boarding house and kept a mental ledger of every social transaction in Redemption Creek, had cataloged his responses like a naturalist cataloging species. Good enough, 2 words. More coffee, please, 3 words. No, 1 word used frequently. On a remarkable occasion when Reverend Stiles had pressed him on whether he believed in the Almighty, he had said, "That is my business," which Dorothea counted as 5 words and declared a record. The children had given him a nickname, with children's unerring instinct for the essential. They called him the Quiet Man, and they were simultaneously fascinated and frightened by him the way they were fascinated and frightened by the deep part of the swimming hole. He was not cruel to them. He had once, when little Thomas Beaumont had cut his hand badly on a fence wire and was wailing in the road, calmly torn a strip from his own shirt, bound the wound with practiced efficiency, and carried the boy to his father's store. He had not said a single word throughout. He had set Thomas on the counter, met Hector's eyes, and walked out. Nobody knew where Elias Cade had come from. Nobody knew who his people were, whether he had family somewhere, or what had happened in the years before he rode into Redemption Creek on that ash-gray horse. The horse, whose name nobody knew because Elias had never said it, had died the previous spring of colic, and Elias had buried it in the corner of his property near a stand of mesquite trees with a marker nobody had seen up close. He had walked the 6 miles into town afterward to buy another horse, a big roan with a temper, and said nothing about the loss to anyone. But Dorothea Ames, who paid close attention to the silences of people she found interesting, had noticed that the lines around his mouth had deepened for a few weeks after, and she had filed this observation in the place where she kept her most careful conclusions. So that was the situation as October 1878 arrived, which meant the Harvest Social was coming, an event that Redemption Creek took as seriously as any civic ritual. The Harvest Social was held every year on the first Saturday of October in the wide yard behind the church, where the pecan trees provided shade enough that dancing could continue into the evening without the heat becoming truly unreasonable. Tables were dragged from inside the church, covered with every kind of food the women of the county could produce, and a small band of 3 musicians, old Pete Larson on the fiddle, his son Carl on the guitar, and whoever could be persuaded to sit behind the upright drum that lived in the church's back room, played from sundown until the last couple either gave out or went home. It was a genuine affair. The young unmarried men came with their hair slicked down and their boots brushed. The young unmarried women came in their best dresses, which had often been let out or taken in or turned at the cuffs to account for another year's use, but were worn with the dignity of finery regardless. Families came in wagons from as far as 12 miles away. Even the rougher element from the brass spur generally behaved themselves, because Redemption Creek's mayor, a former cavalry officer named Howard Finch, had made it plain after the incident of 1876 that weapons inside the social grounds would result in permanent banishment from any future events, and people were generally more frightened of social exclusion than of Howard Finch himself. Clara Whitfield arrived in Redemption Creek on the Tuesday before the Harvest Social aboard the stage from San Antonio, which was running 4 days behind schedule due to a broken wheel axle and a stretch of road that had been badly washed out by the rains that had finally come to break the dry September. She arrived with 2 large trunks, a hat box, a carpet bag, and a younger brother named Daniel who was 19 years old, already half a foot taller than she was, and deeply unhappy about being in Texas. Clara was 22 years old. She had auburn hair so dark it looked almost brown until the light caught it and revealed its real color, which was something between mahogany and fire. She had green eyes with a quality of directness in them that many people found briefly startling before finding it comfortable, the way a bright room is startling after darkness, and then simply pleasant. She was of medium height, not slight but not imposing, with the kind of posture that suggested someone who had been told to stand up straight enough times that it had become genuine habit. She wore a traveling dress of deep green wool that was dusty from the road, and she wore it as though it were not dusty at all. Her purpose in Redemption Creek was uncomplicated. Her father, William Whitfield, had been the partner of a man named George Cassidy, who had farmed 200 acres 8 miles south of town. George Cassidy had died the previous February without a wife or children, and had left his property to William Whitfield in a will that the county had taken 6 months to process. William Whitfield himself had died in May, a fact that had not reached the county records in time to complicate things legally, though it certainly complicated things personally. He had died leaving Clara and Daniel the land, a property they had never seen, in a state they had visited only once as children, with a very modest sum of money that would need to become more money fairly quickly if they were going to make something of the situation. Clara had made the decision to come because someone had to, and Daniel, for all his 19-year-old height, was still in many ways the boy who needed a direction pointed out to him before he could move in it. Their mother had died when Clara was 14 and Daniel was 9, and she had stepped into the organizational role of the household with the same straightening of posture she brought to everything else. She was not bitter about this. It was simply what had been required. She and Daniel were met at the stage by a man named Arthur Penn, who served as the county land registrar and had been corresponding with Clara since the spring about the Cassidy property transfer. Arthur Penn was a small, fussy man with excellent intentions and a tendency to talk continuously when nervous, and the arrival of a young woman who was about to become the owner of 200 acres of Texas farmland made him very nervous indeed, though she could not have said why. He drove them out to the property in his wagon, talking the entire way. The property was in fair shape, he explained. The main farmhouse was solidly built, 2 stories, 4 rooms below and 2 above, with a root cellar and a good well. The barn needed a new roof on the east end. The south fields had been fallowed this year but could be productive again with proper attention. There were 3 horses in the paddock and a mule named Clarence who had very definite opinions about working on Sundays, and Arthur Penn said this last part as though it were a point in the mule's favor. Clara listened to all of this and looked at the land as they drove through it. It was beautiful in the way that Texas is beautiful when the autumn comes and takes the brutal edge off the heat, leaving the sky a color of blue so deep it seems to go backward forever, and the grass turning gold along the creek edges, and the pecan trees heavy with their harvest along the fence lines. She felt something shift in her chest when she saw it, not grief exactly, though it contained grief, but something more like recognition. As though she had been waiting to see a thing she did not know she had been waiting for. She did not say this to Arthur Penn. She said, "Thank you for the thorough account, Mr. Penn. We will manage quite well." Daniel said nothing. He was looking at the horizon with the particular expression of someone calculating the distance to somewhere else. On the Wednesday, Clara walked into Redemption Creek alone to introduce herself to Hector Beaumont and arrange a line of credit at the general store while she assessed the property's needs. She had left Daniel with a list of fence repairs and the confidence that he was perfectly capable of managing them, which he was, once sufficiently motivated by the knowledge that she was watching his progress upon return. Hector Beaumont was surprised by her, which he would not have admitted, because he was surprised by anyone who came through his door, and immediately made it clear that they knew exactly what they needed and had already figured out a reasonable payment arrangement. He introduced her, as was his habit, to the 3 or 4 customers presently in the store, and this was how Clara Whitfield first became aware of Elias Cade. He was at the back of the store, examining a coil of wire with the focused attention of someone who was making a specific determination. He was taller than she had expected when he straightened slightly at the sound of introductions, and he turned his head just enough to acknowledge that a thing was happening nearby, those gray eyes moving briefly in her direction before returning to the wire. Hector said his name. Elias gave a single nod. Clara said, "How do you do?" and he said nothing, which she found interesting rather than rude because the nothing was not cold. It was simply quiet. She bought her supplies, arranged her credit with what she privately felt was an excellent negotiation on terms, and walked back out into the October sunshine. She had a great deal to do and very little time in which not to do it. The harvest social was mentioned to her 4 times within 24 hours of her arrival, which told her all she needed to know about its importance. Dorothea Ames mentioned it while showing her the boarding house, where Clara had deposited one of her trunks for reasons she had not fully examined. The woman at the well on Thursday morning mentioned it while they were both drawing water. Arthur Penn mentioned it in passing when he came by Friday morning to check that she had found everything in order. And Reverend Stiles mentioned it on Friday afternoon when he stopped by to welcome her to the community with what appeared to be a genuine warmth that Clara suspected was also partly a desire to count a new head for his congregation. She said she would attend. Of course she would attend. She had no intention of arriving in a new community and immediately establishing herself as someone who kept to herself, because she had more practical sense than that. A community was a network, and a network was how you survived difficult years when your crops failed, or your well went dry, or you needed an extra hand for the harvest. She understood this the way she understood weather. What she did not anticipate was that attending the harvest social would become the thing she thought about for the rest of her life as the exact moment when everything changed. Saturday evening came warm for October, with a wind out of the south that smelled of grass and the last of the summer's heat softening into autumn's first real promise of cool. The yard behind the church was strung with lanterns that swayed gently in the wind, creating a moving pattern of light and shadow across the packed earth that served as a dance floor, and the tables covered with quilts and loaded with food. Pete Larson was tuning his fiddle when Clara arrived with Daniel, who had grudgingly pressed his shirt and was now affecting an expression of dignified indifference that did not quite conceal his curiosity. Clara wore a dress she had made herself, as she had made most of her clothes, from a bolt of deep blue cotton that she had been saving since the spring. It was simpler than elaborate, cut with the clean practicality of someone who knew how to sew well and had no patience for decoration that served no structural purpose. But it was deeply flattering in the way that simple, well-made things often are. She had done her hair up with the small set of combs that had been her mother's, and she wore no jewelry because she had sold most of it to finance the journey, and was not in the least bothered by this because there was nothing wrong with making practical decisions for good reasons. The social was everything it had been described to be. The food was extraordinary in that way of communal cooking, when every woman brings her very best. There was dancing within 10 minutes of the music starting, the young men overcoming their Haslick-down nervousness with the assistance of the fiddle, which played with such joyful insistence that it was nearly impossible to stand still. Clara danced twice in the first hour, once with a tall, freckled man named Willie Coates who farmed corn on the east side of the creek, and clearly thought himself more charming than he was, and once with Daniel himself, who was a better dancer than he would have admitted and was beginning, Clara noted with amusement, to look less like he wished he were somewhere else. She got a plate of food and stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching the community display itself to itself, which she found genuinely pleasurable. She liked people. She liked the way they organized themselves around music and food and ritual without needing to be told to. She liked watching children spin until they fell down, and old couples dance with the easy confidence of people who have long since stopped caring whether anyone was watching. And she liked, though she would not have said this aloud immediately, watching the tall man who stood at the very outer edge of the lantern light, near the fence, with a cup of something in his hand and the particular posture of someone who has come to a place, because not coming would have required more effort than coming, but who has arrived at the absolute minimum distance from the proceedings that still counts as attendance. She recognized him from the general store. The quiet man, she had heard Dorothea call him, in the way one might name a fixture of the landscape. Elias Cade. He was standing with one shoulder against the fence post, watching the dancing with an expression that she could not read from this distance, which made her want to read it from a closer one. She thought about this for approximately 3 minutes, during which she finished her corn bread and watched Willie Coates attempt to dance with the Harkins girl and be gently but clearly rebuffed. She thought, there is no reasonable reason not to. She thought, The worst that can happen is he nods and says nothing, which is simply a brief social exchange. She thought, he is standing there alone and has been standing there alone this entire time, and if no one has spoken to him in 3 years except in 5-word increments, it seems a shame. And then she walked across the yard to him. It was perhaps 40 feet from where she had been standing to where he was, and the walk across that space took perhaps 15 seconds, and she would remember it for the rest of her life as one of those moments that feel both impossibly ordinary and entirely momentous. The way stepping off a threshold into a storm feels ordinary because it is only a step, and momentous because of what comes after. She stopped beside him and looked out at the dance floor for a moment, following his line of sight, and then she turned to look at him. Up close, the gray eyes were more complicated than she had appreciated from across the store. They were watching the dancers with an expression she now understood. It was not boredom and it was not disdain. It was longing, very carefully and very thoroughly folded inward, the kind of longing that has been lived with long enough that the person has almost made peace with it, but not entirely. He turned to look at her when she stopped beside him, and the expression shifted into something more guarded. Clara Whitfield looked at Elias Cade, and Elias Cade looked at Clara Whitfield, and there was a silence between them of perhaps 4 seconds. Then she said, "Would you like to dance?" The question landed in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripple of it was visible in his face. Something moved through those gray eyes that was not guardedness and not the folded longing, something more immediate, more present. He said nothing for 2 full seconds, which was long enough that she prepared herself for the nod. And then he said, "I do not know how." 6 words. Dorothea Ames would have been beside herself. Clara's expression did not change except for the very slight softening around her mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile. She said, "I will show you then. It is not difficult once you stop thinking about your feet." He looked at her. He looked at the dance floor. He looked at the cup in his hand as though wondering what to do with it, and she took it from him with an easy motion and set it on the fence post. She said, "Come on." They went. It was not graceful at first. It was not graceful for a solid 3 minutes, during which Elias moved with the careful deliberateness of someone performing a mathematical operation rather than participating in music, and Clara directed him with a patience that was entirely genuine, because she found something deeply endearing about a large, competent-looking man being utterly at the mercy of a fiddle. She told him where to put his hands and where to step and when, and he followed with a concentration so total that she found herself wanting to laugh, not unkindly, but with the specific joy of watching someone encounter something entirely new. And then something happened. Pete Larson shifted into a slower reel, a long rolling thing in 3/4 time that had room in it for 2 people to simply move together rather than navigate a pattern, and Elias stopped counting his steps and simply began to move. He had natural rhythm, she discovered. It was there underneath the calculation, waiting. Once he stopped thinking about it, his body understood the music in a way that his mind had been blocking, and the change was so immediate and so complete that Clara felt it like a physical shift in the air between them. He was looking at her now rather than at his feet. Those gray eyes were direct and clear, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes sometimes in important moments, that whatever walls existed around this man were very old and very solid and very thoroughly constructed, and that she had just walked through a door that most people had not known was there. Neither of them spoke again for the duration of that dance. When the music stopped for the musicians to rest their hands and take their own refreshment, they stepped apart naturally, and Elias Cade looked at her with an expression that she recognized, though she would not have been able to say from where, as the expression of someone who has just understood that something irreversible has occurred and has not decided yet how to feel about it. He said, "You are the Cassidy Land." She blinked. Then she understood. She said, "I am Clara Whitfield." "The Cassidy land belongs to me and my brother Daniel now, yes," he said. "It is good land," she said. "I believe it is. I have not had long enough to be certain. He said, the east fence needs work. Then he paused and added, I can help. 9 words. 10 if you counted the fence statement and the help offer separately, which you had to. Dorothea Ames, who was watching from across the yard with the intensity of a woman who understands that she is witnessing history, would count them twice and both times arrive at 9. Clara looked at him steadily. She said, I would be grateful for any help, Mr. Cade. We are just beginning here and there is a great deal to learn. He nodded. Then he said, tomorrow. She said, tomorrow would be excellent, and that was how it began. Elias Cade showed up at the Cassidy property at 7 in the morning on Sunday, which Clara noted was not, strictly speaking, a working day for anyone in Redemption Creek who paid the slightest attention to the Sabbath, but which she chose not to mention because she herself had already been up since 5 and had been waiting for something useful to do. He came with tools in his saddlebags, and the roan horse picking its way along the track that ran between his property and hers, which she had not realized were adjacent in this way, though she should have because of their positions relative to town. Daniel met him at the gate with the particular combination of suspicion and hope that characterized Daniel in most new situations involving other men. Elias gave him a single direct look and held out his hand, and Daniel shook it, and something was established between them that Clara observed with satisfaction. They worked on the east fence all morning. Elias worked with a methodical efficiency that Clara found, watching while she divided her attention between the fence work and the business of assessing what the root cellar contained and what it lacked, deeply satisfying to observe. He did not waste emotion. He did not make a show of effort. He simply worked, and the work was good, and the fence came together the way it should. At noon, she brought out a meal she had prepared, bread and cold salt pork and dried apples and coffee made properly in the pot she had found among George Cassidy's things. The 3 of them sat in the shade of the barn, and Clara asked Elias questions with the same directness she brought to everything. She asked him how long he had been farming his 40 acres. He said 3 years. She asked him what he grew. He said wheat and some corn and some kitchen garden things for himself. She asked if he knew much about the kind of soil conditions in this part of the county. He said more than a little, and then he told her about the drainage patterns and the way the water moved in wet years versus dry years, and where the vulnerable spots were in a field if you had a late frost. He said all of this in more words than she had believed he had in him, and as he said it, he stopped looking at the middle distance and began looking at her, and she listened with both her full attention and her memory, because this was practical information she was going to need. When the meal was done and they returned to the fence, Daniel said quietly to his sister, when Elias had moved ahead to the next section, he talks more than people say. Clara said people had not asked him the right questions. Daniel considered this with the openness of 19 and said, I suppose that is fair. The fence was finished by late afternoon. Elias gathered his tools with the same efficiency with which he had worked, loaded them into his saddlebags, and turned his roan toward home. He stopped at the gate and looked back. He said, the roof on the barn east end. I have lumber from when I replaced my own. You are welcome to it, Clara said. I will pay for it. He said, we will see. And he rode away, and Clara stood at the gate watching him go, and felt a warmth in her chest that was not entirely related to the successful repair of a fence. October moved through its paces with the steady momentum of a season that knows what it is doing. The days shortened with the reliable precision of the calendar, and the nights grew cool enough that a fire felt good, and the pecan trees along the creek dropped their nuts in quantities that filled baskets and then tubs, and then the back of the wagon. Clara and Daniel were busy in the way that being responsible for 200 acres of land that has been let run without close attention for a year makes you busy, which is to say comprehensively, and from first light to last. Elias came 4 more times in October, and each time he came with something, the lumber as promised, a knowledge of where to find a specific kind of river clay that patched the chimney mortar better than anything else, an assessment of the South Fields that was so precise and practically useful that Clara spent an hour after he left making notes. He did not stay long. He came, he worked, he said what needed saying, and he went. But with each visit, the radius of what needed saying expanded, and Clara met it with questions and with her own observations, and Elias answered with increasing completeness. She learned things. Not his history, which he did not offer and which she had the patience not to demand, but the texture of his thinking. He was not a simple man. He was a man who had, for reasons that were his own, constructed a life of deliberate smallness around himself, not from limitation but from choice, the way you might build a wall not because you cannot see over it but because you need something solid to put your back against. He read, she discovered one afternoon when she spotted the corner of a book in his saddlebag and asked about it. He said it was Thoreau. She said she had read Thoreau. He looked at her with those gray eyes, with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to surprise. In November, the weather turned properly cool, and the work on the property shifted from the outdoor structural repairs to the indoor preparation for winter. Clara had arranged with Hector Beaumont for a consignment deal on the pecan harvest, and the money it brought was modest but real and covered the cost of the winter provisions she needed. She was running the arithmetic of the situation with the constant low-level concentration of someone who is managing more financial variables than they strictly like, but she was not afraid. She had done harder sums than this. Daniel had found a friend, a young man named Robert Tanner whose family farmed the next property to the south, and the friendship was doing him good. He was less restless, less prone to looking at the horizon with calculation. He had begun, Clara noted one evening, to look at the land with an interest that was becoming something like attachment, which was exactly what she had hoped for and had been careful not to mention in case the mention of it caused him to resist. She was thinking about all of this on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, when she heard a horse in the yard and looked out the window and saw Elias Cade. He dismounted and stood in the yard for a moment, which was unusual because he generally came directly to whatever task he had come for, and then he walked to the door and knocked, which he had never done before because they had always been outdoors. Clara opened the door, and Elias Cade stood in the frame of it with his hat in his hands and an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has decided to do something that he is not sure he knows how to do. He said, "I would like to take you riding if you are willing." 6 words to the invitation itself, which she was already counting without meaning to. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Give me 5 minutes." She put on her coat and boots and came back downstairs, and they went. He took her east, away from town, along the creek where the pecan trees thinned and the land opened up into a broad sweep of grassland that curved gradually uphill to a low ridge. At the top of the ridge, he stopped his horse, and she stopped hers beside him, and they looked out over a landscape that stretched so far in every direction that the horizon seemed like a rumor. The afternoon sky was the deep blue of late autumn, cloudless, with the sun low and golden, throwing long shadows that made the grass look like hammered bronze. Neither of them said anything for several minutes. Then Elias said, "I come here when I need to remember it is bigger than whatever is in my head." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the horizon. She said, "Does that happen often, things getting bigger than the space of you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Less than it used to." She did not ask what that meant. She did not need to. She looked back out at the horizon and let the sky do what he had said it could do. On the ride back, they talked. It was the longest they had talked, and it happened with the ease of two people who have reached the point in a new acquaintance where silence has become so comfortable that speech feels like a natural extension of it rather than a departure. She told him about her father, about the long years of managing the household in a small city in Virginia that she had left without regret. She told him about making the decision to come to Texas, how it had felt like stepping towards something rather than away, even in the grief of it. She did not tell him she had been frightened. She had been frightened, but that was hers. He listened the way some people listen, with his whole body still and his attention complete, and she found this more comforting than she had expected because she was accustomed to talking to people while they half listened. When she finished, he said, "You are not what I expected." She said, "What did you expect?" He thought about it. He said, "Someone with less direction." She laughed, genuinely and without self-consciousness, and the sound of it seemed to startle him in a way that was entirely pleasant, because the corner of his mouth turned up, just slightly, the first time she had seen anything on that careful face that was approaching a smile. The weeks continued. The visits continued. The conversations deepened in the way of conversations between two people who have a great deal to say but have been in the habit, both of them in their different ways, of saying very little, so that the accumulation of words feels both belated and abundant. She told him more about her mother. He told her, once carefully, that his had died when he was 11, and that his father had not been the kind of man you learned resilience from so much as in spite of, and he said this without bitterness, with only the flat accuracy of long understanding, and she received it with equal plainness, because she understood that anything more would have required him to carry more than he was offering. She learned that the reason he had come to Redemption Creek specifically was that a man he had known before, a former soldier turned farmer, had told him there was land available that could be made productive with work and patience, and that the man had died of a fever the same summer Elias arrived. She learned that the horse he had buried under the mesquite had been called River because she finally asked. He said the name as though it cost him something, and she marked it. She told him about the man she had almost married in Virginia, who had been perfectly pleasant and entirely wrong, and how she had understood this with more certainty than she had ever understood anything before the engagement was 3 months old, and had told him so directly and had never regretted it. Elias listened to this with the focused attention he brought to all her words and said, "He was not seeing you then." She looked at him when he said this, and he was looking at the fire, which had become their setting by December, because the evenings were cold enough now that she had taken to making coffee when he came, and they sat at the kitchen table by the stove. By December she was thinking about him when he was not there, which was not unfamiliar as a feeling, but was more persistent than any previous version of it. She was thinking about the line of his jaw in the firelight, and the way his hands moved when he was working, and the quality of his attention when she spoke, which was like being held in a steady light. She was thinking about the corner of his mouth that sometimes turned up. She was thinking about the 6 words he had spoken to ask her riding, and how they had cost him something, and how he had paid the cost anyway. On a Wednesday in early December, Daniel told her over breakfast that Willie Coates had said in town that Elias Cade had been seen at the Brass Spur the previous Saturday night, which was unprecedented. He had apparently not been drinking. He had apparently been sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee, which the Brass Spur did not normally provide, but had provided for Elias on this occasion, and he had been sitting there for 2 hours before leaving without having spoken to anyone. Clara said, "Why do you suppose he was there?" Daniel looked at his sister with the frankness of 19. He said, "I think he was trying to figure out how to be somewhere people are." She thought about this all day. On Friday, Elias came. They had coffee. The conversation moved through its usual territories, the land, the winter provisions, whether the South Field would benefit from being broken in early spring before the last frost risk, the book she was currently reading, which was a volume of George Eliot she had brought from Virginia. He listened to her describe it with that quality of attention. Then there was a silence that was different from the other silences, which she had learned to read by now the way you learn to read weather, in the quality of the air before anything changes. He said, "Clara." It was the first time he had used her name. She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to tell you something." She said, "All right." He looked at the table for a moment and then he looked at her. He said, "Before I came here, before Redemption Creek, I was not a person who was going to be all right. I thought I was. I had the land and the work and enough quiet to get through most days without the worst of it, but I was not a person who was going to be all right. She held very still. He said, I do not know what the worst of it was exactly. That is not what matters. What matters is that I had decided, without entirely noticing I had decided, that I was going to stay on the outside of everything. Because that was the only way to be sure of not losing anything else. And I had been doing that for a long time when you walked across that yard at the social and asked me to dance. Her heart was doing something she was not going to examine in detail at this moment. He said, I want you to know that. I want you to know that I understand what it means that you did that, and that everything since has been different. And that I am trying to learn how to say things that matter, which is something I apparently stopped knowing how to do a long time ago, but I am trying. Clara Whitfield looked at Elias Cade for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was large and work-roughened and very still, and she said, You are doing quite well. His hand turned under hers and held it. They stayed like that for a while, with the stove ticking and the wind moving outside and the lamp burning steady, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said yet. But something had been established that was as solid as the fence posts he had set in her east field, and as irreversible as the dance. Christmas came to Redemption Creek with a cold snap that was genuinely bitter, which the old-timers said was the first proper winter in 4 years, and the county seemed to respond to it with a collective cozy satisfaction, as though a thing had been missing and was now returned. The church held its Christmas service and then a modest celebration, and Clara attended with Daniel and sat near the back, and Elias Cade sat beside her, which was noted by absolutely everyone in the room and discussed with extraordinary enthusiasm for the following 2 weeks. Dorothea Ames was beside herself with happiness, which she expressed by saying very little about it directly, and a great deal about it obliquely to everyone she met, in the way of someone who understands that containing their commentary to the oblique preserves their dignity while still communicating everything. On Christmas Day, Elias came to the Cassidy property for dinner, which Clara had prepared with more care than she generally brought to cooking, which was already considerable. There was a roasted chicken and sweet potatoes from the root cellar, and preserved beans and cornbread, and a dried apple pie that she was privately proud of. Daniel and Robert Tanner, who had come as well because his own family had gone to his aunt's 3 counties east, ate with the enthusiastic thoroughness of young men who appreciate food and effort equally. After dinner, when Daniel and Robert had gone outside to do something about the barn, which was their version of giving the adults privacy, Elias and Clara sat by the fire, and he gave her a gift. It was a carved wooden box, small, made from the pecan wood that grew along the creek, carved with a precision and care that she understood the moment she held it had taken considerable time. On the lid he had carved a small pattern of leaves and a single bird in flight. It was the most beautiful thing he had made with his hands that she had seen, and she understood from this that his hands did more than fence work when he was alone, and that this gift was a kind of opening of a door she had not known was there. She said, Elias, this is extraordinary, he said. I have been making things for a long time with no one to give them to. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with those gray eyes direct and clear, and without any of the careful folding inward, and she understood in this moment with complete certainty that she was in love with this man, which was not a surprise because she had been aware of its approach for some time, but the certainty of it when it arrived was still remarkable. She stood up from her chair and he stood, because he always stood when she did, which was the kind of thing she found utterly and completely disarming, and she kissed him. It was brief and it was certain, and it was the kind of kiss that establishes rather than asks, and when she drew back, he was looking at her with an expression that was entirely new on that careful face. It was open. It was the expression of someone who has just walked out of a very long shadow into light and has not yet had time to accustom the eyes. He said very quietly, Clara. she said. "Merry Christmas, Elias." He laughed. It was a real laugh, full and low, and it was the first time she had heard it, and it was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. January was hard but manageable. The south pasture had frozen, which meant Daniel and Clara spent several days hauling water from the unfrozen section of the creek for the horses and the mule, and Elias came and helped without being asked, which had become his pattern, and Daniel accepted the help with the easy gratitude of someone who has stopped cataloging debts, because they have moved into a different kind of relationship with the person helping. He had decided by January that he liked Elias Cade with the same clear simplicity with which Elias did most things, and Elias had made it clear that he had an equivalent regard for Daniel, which he expressed by teaching him things: how to check fence tension, how to read the specific clouds that meant a hard freeze was coming, how to set a wagon wheel properly when it had come loose, all without making Daniel feel taught, which was a quality Clara recognized as exceptional. February brought the thaw and the first tentative warmth and the beginning of the planting season, which Clara threw herself into with the concentrated energy of someone who has survived a first winter and is ready to do something more than survive. She had decided, based on everything she had learned from Elias and from her own assessment of the land and the market at Redemption Creek and the larger market at San Antonio, that the south field should be planted in wheat this spring, that the north pasture could be used for a small herd of cattle if she could arrange credit for the initial purchase, and that the kitchen garden should be expanded significantly because the town had, as she had noticed with a merchant's eye, very little in the way of fresh vegetables in summer and fall, and there was real money in supplying the boarding house and the general store. She presented this plan to Elias one evening, laid out on paper with her figures and her reasoning, and he went through it line by line with the attention he gave to all things practical and important. And when he was done, he looked at her across the table and said, "This is a very good plan," she said. "I know, but I want to know what I am missing." He smiled, the full corner of the mouth version that had become more frequent and that she collected like the pearls she no longer owned. He said, "The creek south of your property floods in May if we get rain. You need to leave the lowest 20 acres in grass as a buffer. Everything else is sound." She adjusted her figures. The plan remained sound. They had fallen into a rhythm by this point that had the quality of something built rather than happened upon. He came 3 or 4 times a week. Sometimes he came early and they worked all day on whatever needed doing, which was always something. Sometimes he came in the evening and they sat by the fire and talked, and occasionally did not talk, and both were equally good. On Sundays they began riding together in the late afternoon, often to the ridge east of town where the sky was biggest, and they talked there in the way that open space makes possible, which is more honestly and with less need to manage what is said. He had begun to talk more generally. Not rapidly, not with the social fluency of someone who had practiced it, but with the careful choosing of words of someone who has decided that words are worth the effort if they are the right ones. He talked about what he thought about, which was often the land and often what he read, and occasionally, when she could see the effort it took him, what he remembered. He told her once about a younger sister he had, named Me, who had died of scarlet fever when she was 7 and he was 16. And he said this with the same flat accuracy he used for hard things, and she received it the same way, but she reached over and took his hand while he said it and kept it afterward. She talked about what she thought about, which was also often the land and often what she read, and sometimes the future, which she thought about with a specific kind of energy, not anxiety but orientation. She was a person who needed to know what direction she was pointing in, and she had found, over these months, that knowing where she was pointing had become easier because the direction had become clearer. She was pointing at this land and this life and this man, and the clarity of it was the steadiest thing she had felt since she was 14 years old and had stood in the kitchen after her mother's death and decided what needed to be done first. Spring came with a rush. The wheat went into the south field in March, and the kitchen garden was broken and planted, and the first 4 cattle came from a breeder in Gonzales County, whose price was fair because Elias knew him from 3 years prior and told Clara he would deal honestly with a straight offer, which he did. Daniel threw himself into the cattle work with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself, and by April it was clear that he had found his particular calling, which was the management of animals, and he was good at it with the natural confidence of someone who has discovered a competency they did not know they had. Robert Tanner was out at the Cassidy property nearly every day by April, ostensibly to help Daniel with the cattle and increasingly clearly because he found reasons to be in the vicinity of the kitchen whenever Clara was baking. Clara noticed this and found it completely charming and said nothing, because some things benefit from time. March also brought something less pleasant. A man named Curtis Webb, who ran a substantial cattle operation north of town, and who had, since the previous autumn, been acquiring smaller properties along the creek, by means that the county's legal framework supported even when its moral framework did not, came to call on Clara. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in his best coat on a very fine horse, and he had the kind of surface charm that comes from years of practice and covers something harder underneath. He told her he was interested in purchasing the south 20 acres of the Cassidy property, and then, in the same smooth tone, that he was interested in making her a very fair offer for the entire 200, given that a young woman managing such a property alone was, he said with a sympathetic tilt of his head, a considerable undertaking. Clara looked at him across the gate with the particular expression she had, which was attentive and direct and entirely without warmth, and she told him she was not interested in selling any portion of the property, that she did not find the undertaking of managing it excessive, and that she wished him a good morning. He started to say something further, and she said, with a pleasant finality, "Good morning, Mr. Webb," and went back inside. She told Elias about it that evening. He listened to the account with the stillness he brought to things that concerned him, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He has done this to 4 smaller properties in the past year. Old Henderson sold under pressure last September, the Krill family last December," she said. "He will not get this land." Elias said, "No." Then he said, "But it would be worth speaking to Arthur Penn about documenting the deed clearly and making certain there are no irregularities in the title that he could use as leverage. Penn is good at this." She went to Arthur Penn the following day, and Arthur Penn, who was genuinely fond of Clara by this point in the way of a man who respects competence when he sees it regardless of whose it is, went through the Cassidy deed with the thoroughness of someone who has seen what Curtis Webb does with deed irregularities and is not going to allow it to happen on his watch. He found 2 small issues in the original filing that had been oversights of a bureaucratic nature, fixed them with the appropriate amendments, and sent Clara home with a deed so clean it might have been written that morning. Curtis Webb came back once more in April, this time without the surface charm, which told Clara a great deal about what he actually thought of her. She told him again she was not interested, and he told her she was making a mistake, and she said she rarely made mistakes and wished him good morning and closed the door. She did not see him again after that, though she heard in town that he had purchased the old McAllister property east of town in May, and seemed to have redirected his attention there, which was a relief to her, and she thought, to Elias, though Elias expressed this by ceasing to look at the north fence line whenever he arrived at her property, with an assessment that was more alert than the fence strictly required. It was in April, on the ridge east of town where the sky was biggest, on a Sunday afternoon when the wind had come around to the southwest and smelled of green things and rain coming, that Elias stopped his horse and turned to her. She turned to look at him. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Ask." He said, "I have been thinking about this for some time, about the right words, about whether I have enough of them now to say the thing correctly. She said, Elias, you have enough words. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she knew now so thoroughly, all the layers of them, the stillness and the depth and the longing that was no longer folded entirely inward, and he said, would you marry me? The wind moved through the grass below the ridge and turned it in waves of gold and green, and the sky was that impossible blue above them, and Clara Whitfield looked at Elias Cade and felt the certainty arrive the same way it always arrived in her, fully and immediately and without requiring examination. She said, yes, Elias, of course I will. Something moved across his face that was not quite the open expression she had seen at Christmas, because it was deeper than that. It was the expression of someone to whom a thing they had believed they were not going to be allowed to have has been given unconditionally, and she felt the looking of it in her chest. He reached out and took her hand and held it, and they stayed on the ridge with the wind and the sky and the land below them, and it was entirely sufficient. They were married in June 1879, in the church with the crooked steeple that nobody had straightened, by Reverend Stiles, who performed the ceremony with genuine feeling, because he was a man who believed in the thing he was officiating and could see, if he had any eyes at all, that this was the real version of it. The whole of Redemption Creek attended, because this was the kind of event that a community recognizes as one of its better stories and shows up for unanimously. Dorothea Ames cried, quietly and with great dignity, during the exchange of vows. Daniel stood beside Elias, which had been Elias' request, and which Daniel had received with the expression of someone who has just been told they are valued in a way they did not expect, and had then covered this with a vigorous handshake and an offer to help with anything that needed doing, which was simply his way. Clara wore the blue dress she had worn to the harvest social, because she had no intention of making another dress for the occasion when this one was the right one, and Elias, who had been told this decision, had looked at her when she told him with the corner of his mouth smile and said, good. After the ceremony, the yard behind the church became, essentially, the harvest social in midsummer, because Pete Larson brought his fiddle without being asked, and his son Carl brought the guitar and someone found the drum, and there was more food than could possibly be consumed, and there was dancing that went until very late. Elias and Clara danced the first dance together with the ease of people who have been learning each other's language for the better part of a year, and he no longer counted his steps because he had long since stopped needing to, and she moved with him in the way that she moved with everything she had fully committed to, which was with complete and unhesitating attention. Willie Coates attempted to dance with Dorothea Ames, who declined politely. Robert Tanner danced twice with Daniel, and then twice with the Harkins girl, and then disappeared with a piece of cake, which was his approach to social complexity. Daniel danced with everyone available to him with the expansive goodwill of someone in excellent spirits, which he was, because by June it was clear that his sister was settled and happy, and the land was doing well, and he had found his own footing in this place he had arrived at reluctantly, and had somehow made into his. They moved Elias' things from the 40-acre property to the Cassidy farm over the course of 2 days following the wedding, which was not a large undertaking because Elias had very few possessions and all of them purposeful. He brought his tools and his books and a small number of objects that Clara understood immediately, and without being told, were important to him. A small tin box that she did not ask about, a drawing done in charcoal that was clearly a child's portrait, worn at the edges, which she understood was me, and a pocket watch that he said had belonged to the man who told him about Redemption Creek, who had been his only friend in the years before, and who he had never got to thank for the information. She put these things in the place of honor on the shelf above the fireplace, and when he saw them there he stopped and looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at her, and she said nothing and he said nothing, and it was the right thing. In the weeks after the wedding, they settled into the life of the Cassidy farm, which was now also Elias' farm and was known in town simply as the Cade Place. The wheat in the south field was coming up well, better than the early projections had suggested because the rains had been timely, and the soil in the south field turned out to have a depth and quality that rewarded the planting. The kitchen garden was remarkable by July, producing more than Clara had planned for because the river clay she had used to amend the soil was exceptional, and the growing season was long. She supplied the boarding house and Beaumont store all summer with fresh vegetables, and then with preserved goods from the fall, and by September she had her own ledger running in the black, which she recorded in her account book with the quiet satisfaction of a general after a battle well fought. Elias expanded the cattle herd. He had an understanding of cattle that Clara had not previously given him credit for, perhaps because cattle had never been the primary conversation. And under his management and Daniel's enthusiastic partnership, the herd grew from 4 to 12 over the course of the summer, acquired through a combination of good judgment in purchasing and a level of care in management that resulted in the kind of healthy animals that produce calves reliably. Daniel, who by August was more certain of himself in Texas than he had been of himself in Virginia, took ownership of the cattle operation in a way that was practically a partnership rather than an employment, and Elias treated it as such, which was the right thing for both of them. The 40 acres northeast of town, which was now unused by anyone, was let to a young couple from Arkansas who came through in August looking for land to lease, and Elias arranged this with a directness and fairness of terms that Clara approved of entirely. The income was modest but steady, and the couple, whose names were George and Patience Morton, were hardworking and earnest and became neighbors in the truest sense within a season. Autumn returned to Redemption Creek with the same reliable beauty as always, the sky deepening, the pecan trees dropping their harvest, the air losing its summer weight and becoming something easier to breathe. Clara was in the kitchen garden one October afternoon when she stopped what she was doing and stood still for a moment with the particular quality of stillness that is different from all other kinds, and understood something. She went inside and thought about it for a day, and then she told Elias that evening after dinner, simply and directly as she told him everything. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child." He looked at her across the table with the most open expression she had seen on that careful face since Christmas, more open even than the ridge in April, and said, "Clara." Just her name, the way he had said it the first time, but with everything different inside it. She said, "I know." He stood up from the table and came around to her and took both her hands and held them, and they stood there in the kitchen with the lamp burning, and the stove warm and the pecan trees outside letting go of their leaves in the October wind, and it was one of those moments that would be recalled for the rest of both their lives with the specific texture of pure joy. The second harvest social, in October 1879, was a full year after the first. Clara and Elias attended together, which was itself a thing so different from the first social that Dorothea Ames required a moment upon seeing them arrive together to compose herself, because she was a woman of genuine feeling beneath the ledger-keeping, and she had been pulling for these two since the moment she watched Clara walk across the yard with her plate of corn bread and her direct green eyes aimed at the most private man in the county. Pete Larson played. The food was extraordinary again because it always was. The children spun until they fell. Elias and Clara danced every dance they wanted to and did not dance the ones they did not want to, which is the particular freedom of dancing with someone you have chosen and who has chosen you. He held her with the ease of someone who has learned a language and no longer thinks about its grammar. She moved with him in the way she moved with everything important. At one point in the evening, standing at the edge of the dance floor in the exact spot where she had been standing a year ago with her plate of corn bread and her assessment of the situation, she looked over at him. He was talking to Daniel and Robert Tanner, saying more than 5 words with the ease that had become his new ordinary, though still with the economy of a man who values what he says, and he was listening with that quality of complete attention. And Daniel was laughing at something he had said, and Elias was very nearly smiling, the full version, the rarest one. She felt the child move for the first time, barely, a flutter, like the wing of a small bird, and she put her hand on her middle for a moment, and the warmth of it, the warmth of the life and the choice and the year that had been, and the years that were going to be, was very nearly too much and entirely not enough. Elias looked over at her across the yard, and their eyes met, and he knew, the way he had learned to know things from her face, that something had happened that was good, and his expression shifted to the one she loved best, which was the open one, the after-the-shadow one. He came over, he said. "Are you all right?" she said. "I am perfectly all right, better than that." He said, "Tell me." She said, "The baby moved." He was quiet for a moment, and then he put his hand over hers where it still rested on her middle, and they stood there together at the edge of the harvest social while the fiddle played and the lantern swayed, and the community moved around them in the ritual they had chosen to belong to. And it was as good as anything that had ever happened to either of them. The child was born in March of 1880, on a Wednesday, with the cold rains of early spring outside the window and the lamp burning bright inside. He was a boy, which Clara had suspected, and which she had not told anyone because she preferred not to speculate about certain things until they were settled facts. He was born with Elias' dark hair and Clara's green eyes, and he came into the world with the decisive energy of someone who has made up their mind. Elias, who had been present for it and had done everything that needed doing with the same methodical efficiency he brought to all things and a level of focused anxiety that was the most frightened she had ever seen him, held his son for the first time and was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "River." She looked at him. He was looking at the baby. He said, "If you are agreeable," she said. "River Cade, yes, I am very agreeable." He looked at her over the child's head with those gray eyes holding everything they had ever held and everything new besides, and she thought, here is the man who never spoke more than 5 words to anyone, speaking entire volumes with the particular language he has built from silence and trust, and she thought, there is nothing in the world more remarkable than a person who chooses, carefully and with full knowledge of what it costs, to open. River Cade grew. The land grew. The cattle herd expanded. Daniel Whitfield became as much a Texan as the soil he farmed, and in the spring of 1881, he married a girl from San Antonio named Hannah Reyes, whose family had been in Texas since before the Republic and who took one look at the Cassidy property, and the man who ran its cattle, and made a decision that Clara found deeply satisfying, because it had the same quality of certainty she recognized from her own. Daniel and Hannah built a house on the east side of the Cassidy land, where the soil was good and there was a view of the creek, and they were close enough that meals were shared several times a week, and children, when they came, would grow up in each other's constant company, which was how Clara had always hoped it would be. Robert Tanner did eventually court the Harkins girl, whose name was Abigail, and the courtship lasted nearly 2 years because Robert was constitutionally incapable of direct action in personal matters, even while being perfectly capable of direct action in all practical ones. Elias observed this for the better part of 18 months and then said to Robert, on a Tuesday afternoon in the barn, 5 words. He said, "Tell her, before it is late," which was 6 words but close enough that Robert took the point and told Abigail, and they were engaged before the following Sunday. Elias carved a wedding gift for them, a small box with a pattern of creek grass and a pair of birds, 2 of them this time, both in flight. The year 1882 brought a drought and a difficult summer, the kind that tests a community the way all hard things do, by showing you what the structure underneath is actually made of. The wheat in the south field came in at half what it should have, and the cattle needed supplementary feed that cost more than it should. Clara sat with her account book in the evenings and worked the numbers with the concentration of a chess player, and Elias sat beside her and they worked them together, which was how they did everything that mattered. They got through it because they had prepared, and because the kitchen garden had been built with the bad years in mind as much as the good, and because Elias' management of the cattle had prioritized a level of physical condition in the animals that gave them reserve when the feed was short. And because the Mortons on the 40-acre lease were good neighbors who organized a communal effort to haul water from the deep parts of the creek for the worst weeks of August, which the community responded to in the way that communities respond to leadership when it is genuine. Curtis Webb, whose North County operation had expanded on thinner margins and less careful management, lost 2 properties in the drought and reduced considerably, which resulted in no more visitors to the Cade Gate, and which Clara noted in her account book under a category she privately labeled justice, because she believed in accurate record-keeping. By the autumn of 1882, the drought had broken and the rains had come, and the world had turned from brown gold to green again, with the extravagant relief of a land that has been thirsty. Clara stood in the kitchen garden in September and looked at the new growth, and felt the satisfaction of having done the right things in the right order and gotten through to the other side, which is one of the deepest satisfactions available to a person. River Cade, now 2.5 years old, had his father's eyes and his mother's determination, and was already making his opinions known in both words and silences, which everyone who observed him found deeply amusing and entirely unsurprising. He had taken to following Elias around the farm with the total confidence of a small person who is certain of their welcome, which Elias had understood from the beginning was the deepest possible gift, and had accepted it accordingly. There was a second child in 1883, a girl this time. They named her Me, which Elias had suggested on a quiet evening, and Clara had said yes to immediately, because she understood what it was to want to bring the people you had lost forward with you into the life you had made. Me Cade arrived in April with red hair that surprised everyone and a temperament that surprised no one who had spent any time with her parents, because she was simultaneously very quiet and very certain, which is the combination that tends to run through people who have inherited the best qualities of both the deliberate and the direct. Redemption Creek, which had watched all of this unfold over the years, had by 1883 absorbed the story of Elias and Clara Cade into its own story in the way that communities absorb their best examples, not as a cautionary tale or an exceptional case, but as evidence of what is possible when someone decides to stop staying outside and someone else walks across the yard and asks them in. Pete Larson still played at the Harvest Social every October. He was slower than he had been, and his son Carl was better than he was now, which Pete acknowledged with a pride that had nothing to do with ego. The social was still held in the yard behind the church, which still had a crooked steeple that nobody had straightened, though Mayor Howard Finch had put it on the Town Improvement Committee's list for the 3rd consecutive year. Elias came to every Harvest Social from 1879 onward. He came with Clara and with River on his hip and later with me in Clara's arms, and then with both children running ahead of them toward the lanterns, and the fiddle with the absolute faith of children who know that joy is waiting for them in specific places at specific times. He did not stand at the outer edge of the lantern light anymore. He was not entirely the man who sought the crowd either, because he was not and never would be, and Clara had understood from the beginning that this was not a flaw but a quality. He was the man who stood at her side and danced when she wanted to dance and talked when he had something to say, and listened with his whole self when others talked, and who had built, from the 40 acres of a dead man's dream, and a silence that most people had taken for emptiness, a life of such genuine substance that it was visible from the outside to anyone who paid attention, which Dorothea Ames did faithfully. She had revised her ledger of Elias Cade's words upward so many times over the years that the original entry about the 5-word limit had become, for her, simply a historical artifact, a marker of before and after, like a date carved into a post. She was fond of saying, to anyone who brought up the subject, which she did not discourage, that she had always known there was more to the man than what showed. She said this with the confidence of someone who has retroactively understood that their early assessment was more accurate than it appeared. On the harvest social of October 1884, when River was 4 and me was 18 months, and Clara was expecting again, which she had told Elias with the same directness she had used the first time, and received the same expression in return. Elias Cade stood in the yard behind the church with the lantern swaying above him and his children beside him and his wife on his arm, and looked at the place where she had crossed the yard 5 years ago. Carrying a plate of corn bread and a direct question, he had been thinking all week about the fact that it had been 5 years. He had been thinking about what 5 years of a life looked like when it was the right life, which was that it looked like a field planted and tended through drought and rain, the kind of thing that becomes more itself with time rather than less. Clara had been watching him think about something all week with the knowledge of him that was now so thorough that she could read the quality of his silences like weather, which she had told him once and which had made him look at her with the expression she loved best and say, "Yes," with a completeness that contained everything. She said now, standing beside him under the lanterns, "What are you thinking?" He turned to look at her. He said, "I am thinking about the social 5 years ago, about you walking across the yard." She said, "What about it?" He was quiet for a moment, which was the way he always answered things that needed the full weight of consideration. Then he said, "I had been standing there for an hour, thinking about leaving, thinking that coming had been a mistake, that it was too much being around everyone." She said, "I know." He said, "And then you came across the yard with your corn bread and you looked at me as though I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and you asked me to dance as though it were the simplest thing in the world." She said, "It was the simplest thing." He said, "It was. You made it that. And then everything after that was different. And what I have been thinking about all week is that I want you to know I understand the size of that. What it meant. What it cost you to walk across that yard to a man that nobody talked to, and to make it look easy, and to then proceed to be patient with a man who had forgotten entirely how to be a person who let anyone near." Clara looked at Elias Cade in the lantern light of the harvest social, with their son sleeping against his shoulder and their daughter pulling at her hand wanting to move toward the music, and she said, "It did not cost me anything. I saw someone standing in the light of a celebration, not quite in and not quite out, and I thought the right thing to do was to ask him in. I was not being brave, I was being practical." He smiled, the full version, the rare and complete one that she had been collecting for 5 years and that never failed to do what it did. He said, "Clara." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you for the practical decision." She laughed. He laughed with her, the low and full sound of it, and River, who had been sleeping, opened one eye and considered whether this laughter warranted waking for, decided it did not, and went back to sleep. The fiddle started up again from across the yard, Pete Larson's son Carl finding the key of something slow and circular and joyful. Me pulled harder on her mother's hand. Elias took Clara's hand from me's and passed me to Clara, and said to the toddling girl with the red hair and the certain expression, "Come on, then," and picked her up with his free arm, and the 3 of them, and then 4 of them when Clara came alongside with her free hand finding his, moved toward the music and the light. They danced. River slept against his father's shoulder. Me laughed at the movement and the lanterns. Clara moved with Elias in the way she always moved with him, which was with the full attention she gave to everything important, and the ease of someone who has been doing a thing long enough that it is no longer something you do but something you simply are. The music played. The pecan trees moved in the evening wind. The stars over Redemption Creek were extraordinary that night, the way the Texas sky could be, so thick and close they seemed to have weight. The town danced around them, and the social continued as it always did, with the reliable joy of a ritual that has been earned by the community that keeps it. And later, when the children were home and asleep in their beds, and the social had wound down to its last couple pairs swaying in the diminishing lantern light. Elias and Clara drove home in the wagon under those stars, with the horses knowing the way and the night air cool, and carrying the smell of autumn and the distant creek. She had her hand through his arm. He held the reins with the other hand and drove unhurried, because there was no reason to hurry toward a home that would be there waiting, solid and warm, the way things are when they are well built and truly meant. She said, "You have come a long way from 5 words." He said without looking at her but with the smile in his voice, "I had a good teacher," she said. "You had a willing student, that is more than half the work." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 3. She said, 3 what? He said, "I have been thinking about names. If this one is a boy, James, for no particular reason, it only seems right. If it is a girl, Sarah, my mother's name." She said, "Both of those are perfect." He said, "Good." They drove on. The stars moved overhead. The horses moved steadily. The road that ran between the town and the Cade farm was well enough known by now that they could have driven it in the dark without any stars at all, which in a way they could, having traveled it in all kinds of weather and all kinds of hour and with all kinds of cargo, and knowing it the way you know something that is yours. Home was the farmhouse with the 2 stories and the good well and the root cellar, and the barn whose roof was now perfectly sound, because Elias had replaced the whole east end 2 summers ago and done it right. Home was the kitchen with the good stove and the table where they had sat so many evenings, and the shelf above the fireplace where Me's drawing and the pocket watch and the tin box lived. Home was the kitchen garden and the south field and the creek that ran along the eastern fence and the pecan trees that were already putting on next year's buds. Home was Daniel and Hannah's house, visible from the upper window, with the light still burning because Hannah was a late reader. Home was the 40 acres northeast where the Mortons had put up a second outbuilding this year, and were talking about buying rather than leasing, which Elias had told Clara he was going to support with a fair offer when they were ready. Home was River's room and Me's room and the 3rd room that was being made ready, thoughtfully and without urgency, because there was time and the time was good. Home was everything that had been built from a dance and a question, and the decision of one direct woman with auburn hair and green eyes to walk across a yard in the October lamplight and ask in the simplest words she had whether a quiet man wanted to come in from the edge. He had. He was. He was entirely and completely and permanently in, and he thought about this every day with the particular gratitude of someone who understands, specifically and without any vagueness, what the alternative was. They pulled up to the house. He helped her down from the wagon with the care he had always shown, not because she needed helping down from a wagon, she was perfectly capable of it, but because it was his way of saying something with his hands that he was also saying with everything else. She went inside to check the children. He unhitched the horses and settled them, which he did with the quick efficiency of long practice. The night was quiet and large and full of stars. He stood for a moment in the yard before going in, the way he had stood in the yard of the general store on that first Thursday afternoon 3 years before he met her, looking at the shape of what he had arrived at. The house glowed from inside with the lamp she had lit. The children were asleep. The land stretched out in the dark around him, and it was his, and it was good, and it was tended. The stove inside was warm, and the woman inside was more than that. He had been a man who never spoke more than 5 words to anyone. He was now, entirely and irrevocably, a man who had found the person worth all of them. He went inside. The door closed behind him, solid and certain, against the October night. The lamp burned on.